Hi, everyone. It's Rebecca Imholz of the Mount Pleasant Chamber of Commerce again. I'm going to fix this slide to make sure that it looks a little bit better. But in the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our moderator today, John Carroll. John, welcome again. Nice to see you.
Glad to be here, Rebecca. Thank you so much for your capable hosting week to week. I was just thinking a little bit earlier about the fact that you came on board at a time that was ahead of all of this pandemic and lockdown and business disruption. And oh my goodness, I'm not sure what we would do without you as a chamber in this role that you have taken on, not only willingly, but with great, great energy and enthusiasm. I can't help but think this is not what you signed up for. And I'm grateful nonetheless that you have taken this on in the way that you have. Doesn't surprise me at all though. So thanks, Rebecca, for getting us started, and welcome everyone to the Pivot. This is a weekly series of informational discussions on what's working and not working in organizations and in the community in the midst of and following the COVID-19 pandemic. The event is presented exclusively by the Mount Pleasant Chamber of Commerce. My role as moderator is to introduce our guests, get the discussion started with some questions, and give those attending live the opportunity to participate using the chat or Q&A function, which Rebecca will be monitoring. Thank you for taking the time with your Mount Pleasant Chamber of Commerce to join fellow members in looking at real-world, real-time strategies and tactics to help you care for your team, your clients and customers, and take care of business in post-pandemic conditions. So the research shows Americans reporting increasing negative impacts on their mental health in the pandemic. 45% of respondents to a recent Kaiser Family Foundation poll said so, and we'll look more closely today at how this translates to the South Carolina Lowcountry with today's guests. We'll meet them and get right into some questions. Our first guest is Stacy Lawrence. After graduating with a bachelor's degree in psychology from Middle Tennessee State University, Stacy earned her master's degree in human development counseling from Vanderbilt University. She is licensed in South Carolina and is a national certified counselor. Stacy has experience working with clients with diabetes from both the adult and pediatric endocrinology clinics at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Stacy has worked with clients to increase their medication compliance, change their lifestyles to increase exercise and healthy eating habits, increase coping for stressors related to living with diabetes, and for other mental health issues that may indirectly affect diabetes. She also has experience working with adolescents with diabetes who act out behaviorally. Stacy operates Psychotherapy for the Lowcountry, serving the Charleston and Mount Pleasant communities. Stacy, welcome. So glad to have you.
Thank you.
Next is Louisa Storen. Louisa has been in private practice since 1985 and is both a licensed independent social worker and marriage and family therapist. Her undergraduate and graduate degrees are from the University of South Carolina, where she earned her master's in social work in 1978. Louisa previously owned and operated a company offering employee assistance programs, often referred to as an EAP, and she is currently the local provider for a national EAP. In her EAP work, Louisa has helped various businesses both in helping individual employees get through situations that are causing problems in their life or work, and in assisting management in dealing with problems, including training. She is currently a marriage and family therapist in Mount Pleasant, offering individual, couples, and family counseling. Louisa is also the Victims Assistance Coordinator for the Catholic Diocese of Charleston, covering all of South Carolina. She works in her private practice with her husband, Joe, a retired engineering and maintenance manager from the manufacturing sector, and they've lived in Mount Pleasant for 23 years. Louisa, welcome. You are on mute.
Thanks so much for having me, John.
So glad to have you. One more introduction and we'll get the conversation started. Our third guest today is Barbara Boatwright. Barbara graduated with honors from Vanderbilt University in psychology and special education before completing her doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of Memphis. After an internship with the Department of Psychiatry at the Medical University of South Carolina, Barbara worked at the Atlanta Counseling Center, where she was introduced to the integration of Christianity into clinical psychology. She has practiced in Mount Pleasant since 1994, specializing in therapy that incorporates biblical truth to promote relational healing and life transformation. Barbara founded Life Resources in 2010, a nonprofit, faith-integrated resource center with offices in Mount Pleasant and the North Charleston, Summerville area, in order to remove financial barriers for people in crisis to receive high-quality, affordable counseling services in time of their greatest need. As clinical director of Life Resources, she is now focusing her energies in training clinicians and working with area leaders. Barbara has been married to Dr. John Boatwright for over 30 years, and they have 2 married adult children. Barbara, welcome.
Thanks, John. It's great to be with you today.
So glad to have you. Okay, let's get right to the questions, shall we? The first question is for Stacy. What do you make of this unprecedented time and its impact on the mental health of Americans and more specifically South Carolinians?
Well, I think that this situation has impacted everybody. I think that in some way, shape, or form, we've all had some sort of way that we felt a transition, we felt loss, we felt some sort of isolation. If we talked about every single way it's impacted people, I think we'd be on here for the whole day. But I think that it's important to realize that as we've had a lot of transitions, as we've had a lot of different losses, which a lot of times we don't think about losses as much, small losses about not having the space or time that we normally have, not having that car ride home to kind of decompress after our work day or different things. We don't normally think about those as losses, but they are. They're time that we would normally have that we don't get to have. There are also transitions, and when we have transition, I think a lot of people forget about the fact that there's a layer of stress with every transition. Even if it's a positive transition, it's something new, it's something different, it's something that we're not used to, it's not familiar. So there's that unknown element that adds stress to it as well. So I think that along with the isolation, which the isolation I think has gotten a lot of publicity. And I really think that instead of saying social distancing, we should be saying physical distancing and socially and emotionally connecting, because that's really still important. And I think a lot of people did kind of socially and emotionally disconnect and kind of hibernate. So I think that that's something that we need to make sure we're getting back. But I also think it's something that we need to make sure that we realize it's happening. Another thing that I think is happening that a lot of people aren't realizing or thinking about is this thing called moral fatigue. So if I choose to go to the grocery store, I have to think about, okay, do I need to wear my mask? Is this going to affect people? Am I going to come into contact with people? Is that going to later impact who I come into contact with later? Does that mean I can't come into contact with family members? Does that mean if I was in contact with someone with work, I'm going to impact somebody at the grocery store? So we're making all of these decisions that really, honestly, we're not used to having to make decisions that impact people's lives to such a great degree outside of us and our world. And it's really exhausting for people. So on top of all of the stress and grief and loss, anxiety, people being worried about what's going to happen and not knowing what to expect, and, depression and sadness with the losses and the isolation and everything happening, it's really impacting people to a great degree. And I think it's important to think about how important resiliency impacting us in a positive way, increasing coping skills. It's been really interesting to see people that are really very anxious, but have already kind of worked through increasing resiliency, increasing their coping skills to where they can access them when they're in the stress response, are actually doing much better than the general population at this point.
Thanks, Stacy. Other thoughts on that?
Stacy, I really like what you said about that social distancing, and that new term that's invaded our vocabulary is really about physical distance. And I agree with you that it's really important. We are made for connection as human beings. And so we are challenged during this time to look at ways that we can connect if we can't be in close physical proximity. So a couple of things that come to my mind would include really having loving touch with family members, with pets, with people that are in your sort of safe within the 6-foot distance rule, but also finding other ways to connect with people through notes or dropping off a loaf of bread or whatever it might be, but just finding ways to reach out compassionately to other people. I have found that with neighbors, for instance, who are elderly and live alone, that talking over the porch it might be the only physical human contact that they have in the course of their day. So all of us can be challenged during this time to find ways to be more compassionate with our neighbors.
And I appreciate that. I agree with that completely. And I think being kind to ourselves in this time too, and thinking about, okay, I'm dealing with this thing. This isn't my normal daily life. This isn't kind of how I would respond to things normally. And this isn't how our neighbor maybe wouldn't respond to things normally too. And those emotions can be really exhausting. We may not be able to kind of get everything done that we normally would do, or we may not feel how we normally feel. So I think along with the connection, being able to be kind, being able to pay attention to the things that we're grateful for, there are a lot of factors that can be really helpful.
I'm seeing a range in the marriage couples I see, from many people who are just delighted to have had the time at home with their mates and their children, and they're really treasuring it and don't want it to change too much, from the other couples that are kind of, their relationships are blowing up, unfortunately. And one significant thing I've seen is an overuse of alcohol. I've had three of my women patients who needed to get treatment during this time. And during this time, of course, Alcoholics Anonymous was not meeting in person, so they had to learn to do that on the computer, or outpatient treatment happened on a computer. So people are getting help, it's just in different ways.
Thank you. Thanks all for that. And you know, what I'm hearing from all of you is that there are so many colliding things. If it were maybe just one or two of these, it could be something that could be addressed or dealt with, you know, constructively and you know, almost in isolation from the other things. But we don't have that luxury right now, do we? We are having change forced on us in a way that we are forced to make decisions, and even a non-decision becomes a decision. Okay, let's Louisa, let's throw a question out for you to start us. With your experience in supporting businesses whose team members often benefit from mental health treatment, what one thing would you say to business owners and executives in this post-pandemic period?
Well, the thing I would emphasize is to support their employees and their families. Obviously, their most important resource is their employees. And before the pandemic, we were at record low unemployment rates. And since the opening of businesses again, I've had two very different reactions this week. One was from an employer who spent a great deal of time reassuring his employees that what has happened to the business is not their fault. He was very, despite the fact in March, their profits went down by 20%. In April, they went down by 50%. He was just very concerned and compassionate about his employees' reaction to that and how they were handling the isolation, how their families were, versus another employer who basically said to his employees, I don't really know if you were really working at home. How can I trust that you were really virtually doing what you said you were doing? And you can be replaced. There are plenty of people who want jobs. And so those were the two such different reactions. And I certainly believe that people should put as much emphasis in maintaining their employees as they do their buildings, their equipment, because there's not only, being humanitarian and compassion and caring about people, but the cost of having to rehire, retrain, the cost of poor morale is huge. And it helps so much when you treat your employees as family and you invest in them. It comes back 100-fold.
Thanks, Louisa. Barbara, you have a thought?
Well, I would, again, I totally concur with what you're saying, Louisa. I'm reminded of some old saying that says people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And so these things that we're talking about are really parallel with whether it's with family members, with neighbors, with colleagues, with employers and employees.
Yes, indeed.
I love that. And it is true. I mean, if people don't feel like you genuinely care, they don't really want to work as hard for you. And I think we've seen was it Google when they came in? I might be wrong, but I think that's the company it was. If they keep their employees happy and they feel like they care about them genuinely, they work so much harder. You get so much more from them. But I think another thing to pay attention to is, as Louisa was saying, the one employer was kind of paying attention and had some perspective on what the employees were going through. I think if we can do that without being invasive, I think it's really important, because if we think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if somebody's worried about how they're going to pay for the roof over their head or their food, they're not going to be able to pay as much attention to what they're doing as if they have their basic needs met. So if we can let them know we care, but also pay attention to what they're needing and see how we can be supportive of them, I'm sure that it would be very helpful.
That reminds me of a conversation I had recently with someone who has a very good friend who works at the police station. And the number of calls related to suicide intent have skyrocketed since this pandemic began. I think this is the Mount Pleasant Police Department. And it goes back again to the resiliency that comes into play when that person who is on the edge of despair recognizes that someone cares that they're alive, that someone sees their worth and their value. And with people losing their jobs, especially in our country where so much of our identity is tied up in our performance, in our success, in how much money we have, or whatever, all of that is fraught with uncertainty now. And I think we're going to see the ramifications of those things play out as time goes forward all the more. People are saying all over the country and really the world that the next pandemic is going to be one of mental health. And so we are facing these challenges of how to provide the kind of care and how to equip our community to do these very simple things that can truly save a life.
Before the pandemic, the idea was at any point in time, 12% of our population was experiencing some personal problems that kept them from being 100% effective at work, whether it be having elderly parents, having teenage children that might be experimenting with alcohol, or grief to depression. And so ordinarily, you think that many people could use counseling. Then you add this pandemic, and I believe 100% of us have been affected in some way. So it's especially necessary that people have connection and ability to get counseling.
Yes, indeed. Thank you for all of that. And we haven't really mentioned it, but in this current climate, which has taken people's lives, right, has claimed people's lives, we don't even have available to us what many of us consider to be traditional grieving processes, right? We don't have the ability to gather as the larger family, as the larger community. Those things become private, they're small. I've heard of people that are actually using online tools to have people join in at a memorial service. Speak to that, if you will, for just a second. I know that wasn't anything that we had prepared for, but talk a little bit, if you will, about the grieving process.
Well, I have one gentleman whose mother died, and he's a physician in another country, and he can't even come back to the country, much less, you know, attend a funeral or be with the rest of his family. It's so complicated. So I think we call that complicated bereavement, you know, where it's not just the grief and the pain, but it's also so many other things that soothed us aren't happening.
You know, it's an interesting thing that tears of grief have a different biochemical composition than tears from peeling an onion, or tears where you laughed so hard till you cried. And I believe that that is part of the body's way, and indeed God's way, of helping cleanse us from the toxicity of pain. Emotional pain is registered in the brain the same as physical pain. And so we have to have ways of letting that pain out. And I think we see in our community, even recently, that there are different ways of expressing that pain. Some are better than others. You know, there's a verse in the Bible that says that God collects our tears in a bottle, and that he knows what's contained in every single one of those tears. And indeed, back in the ancient Roman days, they had tear bottles, and women, when their husbands would go off in, you know, on in shipping or in whatever, when they would go away, the wives would literally collect their tears and present them to the husband when he returned, as a measure of their love and devotion, and how sad they were when they were gone. And I love that there was a tangible way of expressing grief during that time. And so, you know, our society has been so fast-paced. One of the things that I have appreciated about this pandemic is that it has slowed me down. It slowed my family down. I think that we have real opportunity here to stop and smell the roses, to find the small things in life, the ability to be with family members, even if we sort of have to be with family members, and to actually take the time to grieve. You know, there are good resources out there, but again, grieving alone, just like experiencing pain alone, when someone is with us and is sharing in that pain, our physical registration of that pain is reduced. And the same thing happens with emotional pain. We're not meant to suffer alone. And so I think one of the biggest challenges, honestly, is the fact that we can't hold each other if we're grieving across cities like the gentleman you described.
Well, I think that that's a great point, and that's very true. And that's another kind of example of the social distancing piece, or the physical distancing piece impacting us in another way. And if we're not able to process our emotions when we have them, and a lot of people do process them in the rituals that we have when someone passes away. And so I think it's important to find other ways to kind of have those rituals creatively, but also find other ways to process them. And with social support, it's so important. But if we don't process those emotions, they stay in our body and we hold on to them. And we will have them for a very long time if we don't do something with them. And so I think that the other thing that's important, and Louisa, I know that you mentioned complicated bereavement, but also if we look at compounded grief. So not only are we having losses of people, but the multiple losses compound on top of each other. And so that makes it much more complex to process and work through as well.
Thanks, Stacy. The term that comes to mind is cluster, and it probably looks something like that graphic that we all get to see, right? When people talk about the virus, the COVID-19 virus itself, just looks like a mess in there. And I think some people would say that's representative to a degree of their situations and their lives at the moment. This question we're going to ask Barbara to start on. There's a strong faith component in your practice, Barbara. How does that fit into the current efforts of sheltering in place, physical distancing, working from home? How does all of that play together?
You know, I was thinking about that question and reminded of one of the first news stories that I saw when all of this was unfolding in mid-March. And it was images of people in airports and across the world just trying to get home. And I found it interesting that, you know, that the immediate human response was, I want to go home. My kids did that. My children my grown children, married children, came and lived with us for several weeks. And there was this desire to find a place of grounding, to find a place of safety and shelter. And so even when family hasn't always been safe, which we know is true for many people, there's still that longing for home. And so we find ourselves these days in what is called a Kairos moment in time. Unlike chronological time, it's a Kairos event, which means that there's a qualitative shift that is occurring. And so a Kairos event in the positive sense would be getting married or having a baby. In the negative sense, it might be getting divorced. And certainly right now, it's this pandemic. And so the moment begs for a reexamination of what's important. And so, you know, it's like the person who loses their home to a house fire. And if you look at the interviews, they're saying, I'm so grateful that we escaped with our lives. All of a sudden, their lives mattered more than their belongings. And so, so we have this opportunity in a crisis to re-examine the things that are most important to us. And there's an old saying that says there are no atheists in foxholes. And so one of the things that I have found over the course of my practice is that when people are in crisis, they begin to ask a lot of existential questions. They are looking for meaning in life. They're looking for meaning in their suffering. Their questions and potentially confusions about God and faith come to the forefront. And so it's a really important and special opportunity to be able to come alongside people during those times and give them the space and the safety to examine those kinds of questions that may have been dormant until this crisis hit. So a crisis is a dangerous opportunity. You know, it's dangerous. We see a lot of you know, when people are in a crisis, their limbic system gets very activated. And so that's when we see the fight, flight, or freeze kinds of activities. And some people are isolating and like not getting out of their pajamas and sheltering in place. And that's not necessarily the most healthy thing to do. And collectively, as a community, I think that our limbic system is on high alert. The problem with that is that physiologically, we are not able to sustain that, and it results in all sorts of physiological problems, health complications, and so forth. And so what do we do with that? How do we move out of that place, you know, as individuals when we're in crisis, but also collectively as a community? And one of the things that will help usher people out of that place is gratitude, is mindfulness, prayer, looking for a place, a shelter in the storm, so to speak. And the Christian faith offers that. So, so we have found, you know, for example, in Psalm 46, it begins with, God is our refuge and our strength, a very present help in times of trouble. In that very first verse, it says it all. We need a place of refuge, and we also need a place to get strengthened when we're depleted from these kinds of challenges. And God can provide that. I was thinking about some of the great hymns that have been written over time. Amazing Grace with John Newton, who had a horrific life as a child. and was a slave trader. And because of his faith, he ended up coming into a place of seeing the grace of God in his life and changed the world as far as slave trade. Other people, Martin Luther, wrote the hymn, "A Mighty Fortress Is Our God," based on Psalm 46, in the middle of the bubonic plague, when he had opened his own home to try to take care of the poor in his community who were dying from this horrible plague. So these things have remained over the millennia. We are always going to have trouble in this world, and yet we have examples through history of people who found that refuge in God, and so that's just a really important part of the work that we do.
Thanks, Barbara. Wow. Louisa?
Well, I just think it's significant that so many people have gotten comfort and strength from their congregations, and congregations weren't meeting. And some churches have opened up again, but John and I have attended the same church. And in our church, if you're over 65, they ask you not to come. Or if you have immunosuppressed disease, not to come. So many of the people who particularly got refuge at a church aren't really welcome right now, which is a it's sort of a paradox, not what you expect at a time like this.
Right.
Although it's totally understandable.
Right. That safe place that Barbara was talking about, that safe haven, is not the church right now, unfortunately, because of the circumstances with the virus. Oh, my goodness. You all have been so wonderful with your thoughts and comments. Stacy, you have a thought as well.
I do, and I really loved how Barbara called this a dangerous, I think you said dangerous change. Was that it?
A dangerous opportunity.
Dangerous opportunity. And it made me think about, we go through different parts of our life, just like you were saying, where we have, throughout history, where we have things that happen that cause us to look at what's important and kind of what our meaning and purpose are, and make changes. And it made me think about an article actually that they had us read when I started grad school. It's been quite a while, but it was called In Grave Danger of Growing. And basically what it meant is, as you go through this process, you're going to learn so much about yourself, and you're going to learn so much about your purpose and what's important to you, that while it's scary and while it's unfamiliar and while it is definitely out of your comfort zone, you are going to continue growing as a person. And so I love that you said that, and that made me think about that. And if we look at the hope and the resiliency that faith and spirit, I can't speak today, but that it provides to us to be able to have that in our lives, I think it's really important to keep that in mind. And it's really important too, to think about that maybe while there have been people in your life that haven't always made that a priority, they may be making that a priority now. And it's a great thing. And it's not necessarily something to be surprised about.
Good point. There's plenty of other things to be surprised about. We don't need any more right now. Thank you. Rebecca, why don't we get you in here and see what questions are coming either from you or from our live attendees.
Thank you, John. We do have a question from an attendee. What can employers do to encourage insurance providers to continue to provide telehealth for mental health services through the new emergency orders once the EO is rolled back, such as audio only, the relaxed platforms, and payment parity? And this is someone who is the Director of Government Relations for the American Psychiatric Association, so is well versed in this.
Wow. Who wants to touch that one first?
Well, I think it helps when you're an employer that has a quantity of insured people to be able to lobby your insurance company that, you know, we pay you a great deal of money and we want to get the best for our investment. And this is the need that's arisen. The marketplace often comes to bear when there's a need. And telehealth has been so helpful for so many people, and so helpful for us therapists that we could still connect with people without leaving home.
Thanks, Louisa.
You know, there are statistics that show that more employees miss work due to either presenteeism or absenteeism that's due to mental health issues than actually due to physical illness. And so if they would simply look at the real numbers, even prior to the pandemic, they would see that investing in people's mental health is investing in your business.
I agree that telehealth prior to the pandemic and having mental health accessible has been really important. And I think it's something to pay attention to as things reopen. I work with a lot of people that are considered high risk, specializing in diabetes. There are also a lot of people with other medical issues that need mental health services, but due to their medical issues, they are encouraged to stay home even without a pandemic happening, or they are not feeling well enough to be able to really get out and go. And so I think it's important to keep those people in mind as things open up, as people that don't have a high risk are more comfortable going out places. People that do have the high risk probably are going to need it for much longer. And so I think it's just important for them to realize that that will definitely be a preventative measure. Like you were saying, so many people have days off work for mental health issues. And we know that, like I think Barbara said, that the suicide rate was going to go way up. They predicted that. They also predicted divorce rates going up. They predicted domestic violence rates going up. All of these things impact us for longer than just the situation, the traumatic things that happen. And so I think it's important to see that people are going to need treatment for quite a while afterwards to just deal with what they've been through during this time.
Stacy, your point is well taken, and I know we want to wrap this up from a time standpoint. I think the important thing to remember here is that we're still, the trauma event hasn't ended yet, right? We're still in the throes of what has caused so much of the trauma already. And it's like Groundhog Day, right? When we, and I'd love to get back into this. I hope you'll come back and we can talk some more. That Kairos event, Barbara, that you mentioned, maybe that's what leads us to not know what day it is today, because it's that timeless sort of a season or event. I thank you so much, all of you, for having been with us. Let me give you an opportunity, each of you, to add a final thought and to let us know how to find you, because I really do believe that those who attend live or catch us on the recording will want to know how to have maybe a conversation or get in touch with you. So Barbara, let's go in the order opposite how we started, and let's ask you for a final thought and how to find you first.
Well, I think my final thought would be about the willingness. Who was it? Helen Keller said, "The only way out is through." And we have to walk through this time. We can't avoid it. We can't medicate it away. You know, so how we walk through this season. And taking advantage of really trying to develop some new habits that would be healthier for us, whether it's through diet and exercise, whether it's through sleep patterns, whatever it may be, but whether it's through gratitude, practicing gratitude for things that we might have overlooked in the past is important. And it also includes being honest about the emotions that we are experiencing. So I would invite people to reach out for help. It is a healthy thing to do. It is a courageous thing to do. We all need one another right now. And so as far as just saying how to reach us at Life Resources, we have a team of 10 therapists in Mount Pleasant and in the North area. Our therapists are providing both telehealth, and as of yesterday, we are doing some in-house sessions, and that is up to the therapist and the client to decide. And we also have emergency scholarship funding for such a time as this. If you've lost your job, if you have extenuating financial difficulties because of COVID-19, we have emergency scholarship funding where you can be seen for a very low copay, less than what you would spend at Starbucks, to get the help that might make the difference between life and death for people. So we encourage people to seek help. It's a good thing.
Wonderful. Where can we find you online, Barbara?
Our website is myliferesources.org.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, John.
Sure thing. Louisa, same thing, please. Final thought and where we can find you.
Well, I just want to build on what Barbara said in terms of moving through. I heard an acronym yesterday for the word RAIN, and that is to first recognize your feelings, then to allow them instead of repressing them or trying to distract yourself. Just be with your feelings for a little while, investigate what your thoughts are behind those feelings, and then nurture yourself. And I think that is so important. And the other quotation I liked that I heard this week was, rather than survival of the fittest, it's survival of the nurtured. And, you know, I think being kind to other people, being kind to yourself is what's going to get us through all of this. Thanks so much. It was a pleasure talking to both of you, all three of you. Thank you.
Oh, our pleasure, Louisa. Where can we find you?
Louisa at louisastoren.com.
Wonderful. Thanks, Louisa. I appreciate that. And then Stacy, final thought, and where can we find you?
I love all of that. I hate to be last at this. I think that it is really important to be able to acknowledge those feelings and work through them. And so I like that, RAIN. I think that it's not something that we can hide from and we can't medicate from, just like Barbara said as well. I think that if we can focus on resiliency and coping skills, and also the coping skills that we find, to practice them in as lowest of a stress response as we can, will help us be able to access them better when we are in the stress response. So it's a little hard right now. If we're starting that now, we're starting a little bit behind because a lot of people are staying activated in the stress response so much. But breathing exercises, progressive muscle relaxation, there are a lot of things that you can find that can help bring your body down from that stress response and give yourself a little bit of a respite, but also being able to practice those things enough that, again, we can access them when we are in that stress response. So doing things like that, doing self-care, getting out in nature, just things that are really nourishing, those are the things that help support us through stressful and difficult times. So I think that those are just really, really important to do as much of those as we can that's not going to stress us out.
Stacy, thank you so much. Where can we find you?
So Psychotherapy for the Lowcountry is online. It's stacylawrence.net.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank all three of you for being with us. I can't thank you enough. And I was serious about maybe you'll come back and join us again. There's so much more to this conversation. We've scratched the surface, and we'd love to have you back. Thank you, Stacy Lawrence, owner of Psychotherapy for the Lowcountry, Louisa Storen, owner of her private practice in Mount Pleasant, and Barbara Boatwright, Executive Director of Life Resources in Mount Pleasant and the North area, for your time and participation. Thanks to all of our chamber members with us live and those catching us on the recording. And a big thank you to Mount Pleasant Chamber's own Rebecca M. Holtz for keeping us on track today. From all of us at the Mount Pleasant Chamber, thank you for joining us this week on The Pivot. Make it a great week.